Emily was shoved out onto the porch, rice spilling everywhere, her stomach gnawing with hunger as the rain threatened to fall. Faint welts from old lashes still traced her small hands, marks left by 100 blows. Across the street, a single father stopped in his tracks. His eyes lingered on the child's trembling fingers before he made his choice. A hand would reach out, and the whole town was about to erupt with the truth. Before we begin the story, tell me where you're from, and after you've heard it, rate it from 1 to 10. Carla flung the door wide open, grabbed Emily by the shoulder, and pushed her down the porch steps. She jabbed a finger at the child's face, her bloodshot eyes blazing. "You're worthless. Eating what's left over, living as a burden. Get out of my sight." Emily staggered, heel catching on the edge of a step, her small body crumpling. The bowl slipped from her grasp, scattering white rice. Grains stuck to the wooden boards, a few clung to her scraped knees. The door slammed shut. Once. Twice. Then came the cold scrape of the lock turning, metal grinding against metal. Inside, silence. The little girl sat frozen. Her hands clutched her empty stomach, her frayed shirt bunching at the waist, dusted with rice starch. Her eyes burned red, lids stinging, but her throat locked tight, refusing to let a sound escape. Any noise might bring Carla back. Emily gathered a few grains nearby with trembling fingers, hesitated, then let them fall. Wind pushed through the eaves. The porch boards felt cold. Emily pulled her knees to her chest, pressed her face into her arms, and listened to her stomach rumble in waves. An old memory flashed. Not an image, but a rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 10, 50. The rattan whip slicing the air, striking, each hiss piling on like sheets of rain. Carla stood tall, her hands steady. Count. Emily clenched her teeth, counting silently. 80, 98, 99, 100. The tile floor chilled her cheek as she collapsed. The light bulb spun, then blinked out. From then on, just the sound of a lock turning was enough to seize her chest. A present sound tugged her back, a sparrow bursting from the gutter. Emily peeked. The bowl lay overturned, thin soup staining the wood with a milky streak. She righted it carefully, setting it near the porch edge so it wouldn't shatter further. Her fingernails scraped the ceramic. Inside, a shadow slipped past the door's crack. Worn slippers, the hem of a dress brushing the floor. Emily held her breath. No shout, no call. Only the faint smell of medicated oil and dish soap. She drew herself closer to the column, back pressed to the wood. Sunlight slid across the roof tiles, sketching a thin line of brightness on the steps. Tears welled, then dried at the corners of her eyes. Emily stared at the grains of rice stuck to the floorboards, whispering to herself not to cry loud. Crying loud meant being heard. Being heard meant the whip. The wind swept by. A neighbor's door groaned open. Her stomach growled again, long and low. Emily licked her lips, nudged a grain of rice onto her fingertip. Cold, hardened, sticky as glue. She didn't swallow. She just held it there, like a thought she couldn't speak. The front gate creaked. Gravel shifted under a shoe. A figure approached from afar, walking evenly through the sunlight. He stopped at the yard's edge, his shadow stretching up the porch steps. Emily didn't look up, but her spine tightened like a taut string. The shadow tilted slightly, glancing at the slammed door, then at the girl. In that instant, all sound collapsed into one, her stomach roaring, loud in the silence. The newcomer had seen it all. He halted at the sidewalk opposite. His coarse cotton shirt sleeves were rolled past the elbows, his pant legs dusted with sawdust. His face was worn, his cheekbones cut with sun-creased lines. Yet his eyes weren't harsh. He looked at the girl curled on the porch, at the door that had swallowed every sound. He didn't call out, didn't step closer. He just stood there, shoulders sloping as if he'd just set down a heavy beam. The leather strap of his tool bag slid from his shoulder. He hitched it back up, his thick, calloused fingers darkened by sawdust. The scent of pine resin drifted with the breeze, mingling with the damp smell of the porch. Emily still hugged her knees, head bent low. Her stomach rumbled again, sharp and loud, like air squeezing out of a rubber ball. The man frowned, not in annoyance, but because that sound pressed against the tiredness he carried all day. His name was Jack Miller, a carpenter. His wife had died 3 years earlier, after a winter so long no one thought they'd make it through. Since then, he'd raised 3 children alone. Sarah, 13, her hair hurriedly braided each morning. Ben, 10, whose laces never stayed tied, and Lucy, 6, forever dropping her spoon with a clang. His mornings began with bread and Sarah's small voice saying, "Daddy, I can do it," as she clumsily pieced together what he fumbled. Fatigue lived in his shoulders, ran down his back when the night clock ticked on the wall. But beneath that weariness was what kept him upright every morning: resolve. That evening, cutting through the narrow lane to shorten his walk home, Jack had heard the door slam, the lock snap. He stopped instinctively, glanced up, and saw the porch with the thin girl clutching her stomach. He hadn't gone closer. He knew the house, knew the woman inside, knew the kind of silence that carried the smell of medicated oil and the faint clatter of dishes. In town, gossip drifted through the grocery aisles, the repair shop, the barber's chair. "That girl's stepmother hates her. She's been cursed since her father fell off the scaffolding." The words always floated off as cruel jokes from idle men. But to Jack, they stuck not because he believed them, but because he despised how people branded a child with a label. He didn't step forward. He chose to stand still, watching. Not out of fear, because he knew one wrong move could make things worse. Instinct made him glance both ways down the street, as if someone else might come first, say the right words at the right time. But the alley was empty. Only a neighbor's dog stirred, gave a half-hearted bark, then quieted. Inside the house, a hem of a dress drifted past the door's crack, thin as smoke. Darkness dropped quickly, the roof's shadow spreading over the wooden steps. The door stayed shut, the lock holding its cold stance. From within came the clink of dishes, the smell of onions sizzling in oil. A woman's voice rang out, then broke into laughter. "Leave it. Don't pour too much. Tonight I need to sleep early." Another voice joined in, thick with liquor. No one mentioned the child on the porch. Emily tugged her shirt hem down to cover her stomach. Hunger clawed, waves of cramps rising and falling against the wooden boards. Her vision blurred off and on. The streetlight flickered, glowed for a moment, then died, leaving only a weak yellow leaking through a neighbor's shutters. Night air seeped into her thin shirt, chilling her back damp. The scrape of a spoon in a bowl carried out, followed by a glass set down hard. Carla's voice, low but cutting through the wood. That girl's stubborn as stone. Her friend waved it off, fingernails tapping against glass. Let her figure it out herself. Words falling like shards of broken glass. Emily bent lower, forehead pressed to her knees. In her mind, stray images rose and sank. Her father stood under the scaffolding, hard hat slick with sweat, gray shirt dusted in cement. He looked up at the house window, saw her peeking out. He raised his hand, smiling with gentle, narrow eyes. Thumb lifted as if to promise, "I'll be home this evening." He tugged the strap, checked the safety hook, every move so practiced it became rhythm. Emily pressed her cheek to the glass, breathing in the dawn mist. That day, he left. But that evening, he didn't come back. People gathered in a circle beneath the scaffolding. Someone said, "Slipped." Someone said, "Loose bolt." Emily didn't understand, only saw her father's hard hat lying tilted, a chalk, like scrape on its rim. The funeral was brief. Smoke from incense curled thick in the borrowed porch of a bricklayer's house. A bamboo table set up hastily. Carla, dressed in black, hid her eyes behind oversized sunglasses and cried just enough when someone was looking. When the last visitor left, the glasses came off. The veil was folded away. Carla walked straight into the kitchen, her voice curt. "Clean it all up. Your daddy's gone, no more pampering for you." Emily clutched the photo, hands shaking, a tear slipping silent. After the funeral, the house changed order. Wooden chairs pushed to the wall. The little stool Emily used was moved to the storage shed. Words grew sharp-edged. "Eat faster. Don't breathe so hard. Do it again." When Emily dropped a spoon, Carla's glance cut. "Try bothering me again." Some nights, dinner was shoved out of reach just because she answered too slow. Some afternoons, a bowl of cold rice slid across the floor, and when she stood to fetch it, Carla snapped, "Leave it." Emily learned how to starve quietly. The house clock ticked each beat. The faint scent of cheap fabric softener drifted, then faded. Emily felt her palms grow cold. She tucked her hands into her armpits, trying to hold what warmth was left. Out in the yard, a tin basin caught the night sky. Its water reflected nothing but black. Then suddenly, thunder rolled somewhere down the levee, like an empty barrel tumbling through clouds. Wind whipped across the porch, whistling through the boards. Emily flinched, her whole body trembling, hands rubbing together before clutching her knees tight. Jack finally stepped off the curb, crossed the gravel street. At the steps, he paused half a beat to listen, then knelt across from her. His knee touched the damp wood with a soft thud. He spoke low, so the wind wouldn't carry it off. "How long have you been out here?" Emily shook her head. Her tangled hair hid half her face. She didn't dare open her mouth. Her teeth chattered, flashing under the yellow porch light. Jack glanced quickly around the yard, then back, his voice steady. "Would you like something to eat?" She flicked her eyes up in a startled glance, quick as a sparrow. Her lips were bluish. Emily didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She only looked at the canvas bag on his shoulder, then dropped her gaze, hugging her knees tighter. The next gust lifted her shirt hem, her thin shoulder blade jutting sharp in the brief flare. Jack set the bag down by his feet, zipper rasping softly. He didn't rush to open it. He lifted his eyes to the dark door behind Emily, the lock still unmoved. Inside, voices had faded. The earlier smell of medicated oil thinned, leaving only the damp scent of coming rain. His kneecaps pressed to the boards. He felt the chill rising from the wood seep through his pants like water. In his mind, he saw the small table back home. 3 chipped porcelain bowls, a pot of soup nearly gone, Ben's spoon clattering as he stirred, Lucy dozing on her chair, Sarah circling the table to lower the flame. "Daddy, I can do it," she always said, wiping the lid dry, the smell of scallions clinging to her sweater. There, a plain supper, but warm. Here, a child sat outdoors with an empty stomach. Jack raised his hand to shield Emily from the wind, a makeshift wall. His fingers brushed the step edge, testing unconsciously for damp, the carpenter's habit he could never drop. His throat burned dry, like he'd swallowed sawdust. Injustice wasn't a word he used. He replaced it with action. But now, what action wouldn't make things worse? He remembered Lucy sniffling one stormy night, trembling at thunder. How he dragged the old thick quilt over all 4 of them, lying still while rain hammered the roof. He remembered Ben, stomach growling, no money left for breakfast, finding half a stale roll, taking a bite then handing most of it to his sister. He remembered Sarah, home from school one noon, pausing at the corner store, suddenly asking, "Dad, if my friend gets blamed for something she didn't do, what should I do?" He'd thought a long while, then told her, "First, stand beside her." Jack looked at Emily. "Your father." He started to ask, but stopped, changed course. "Is there anyone at home with you?" Emily shook her head again. The wind lifted a strand of hair from her cheek, revealing a faint bruise along her cheekbone. Jack felt his face tighten for an instant. He unzipped his bag and pulled out a wax paper bundle. Inside were 2 slices of white bread he'd planned to give Ben as a late snack that night. He peeled open one corner and held it out, palm up so she wouldn't fear being snatched. "Go on, eat." Emily stared at the broad hand and the bundle of bread. Her eyes paused at his index finger where a dry scar crossed the knuckle. She swallowed hard. Her body reacted before her mind decided. Her small hand rose, then froze midair, as if pressed against an invisible wall built of fear. She withdrew, lips moving in a whisper that never formed sound. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. The sky pressed down heavy. A raindrop struck the porch edge and burst into tiny beads. Jack leaned slightly, shielding her head. He knew he stood on the edge of an act that would carry consequences. Warnings, gossip, evenings, when his name would be called out at the head of the lane. But he also knew if he turned away now, his conscience would gnaw him raw, stealing his sleep and souring his meals. "You don't need to say anything," he said softly. "Just take one bite to keep the chill away." His voice rasped. He didn't touch her. He held just enough distance for her to back away if she wished, and just near enough to offer the bread across the space. The next gust carried the smell of damp earth. Emily's eyes widened. She glanced at the door, then back at him. Those seconds stretched longer than the thunder. Then suddenly, behind them, the iron bolt snapped. The door flung open, slamming the wall with a crash. Light from inside spilled out. Carla appeared in the doorway, hair pulled tight in a bun, eyes bloodshot. A silver bracelet clinked on her wrist as she moved. Her voice cut sharp across the porch. "What are you doing here? Don't think I don't know you've been eyeing this girl." Carla stormed onto the porch, seizing Emily's wrist and yanking hard. "Get up, useless brat, always making me look bad." The silver bangles clattered. The stench of liquor hung on her breath. Emily jolted upright, panicked, her foot slipping on the wet boards. instinct driving her closer to Jack as if he were a wall. Jack straightened in a snap, one arm braced to block, the other drawing Emily behind him. His voice was low, each word clear. "You shouldn't treat her like that." Wind swept across, rain drumming at the porch roof. Carla narrowed her eyes, her frame stiff as an iron coat rack. She glanced at Jack's calloused hand, then at the half-opened bread packet on the ground, her lip curling coldly. "What do you know? She's brought nothing but bad luck since her father died. Keeping her alive is already more than she deserves." Emily shrank back, her small fingers clutching at the hem of Jack's shirt, then letting go at once in fear. Jack stood silent a beat. He heard his own breath, the child's stomach growling, the hiss of rain. He fixed his eyes on Carla, measuring how much space was left for words that wouldn't set fire. A child needs care, not humiliation. Carla barked a short laugh, damp with liquor. "Care?" She bent low, lunging to drag Emily out from behind him. "Do you know how many bowls she's broken? Do you know she just sits there, watching while others work?" Her hand clamped Emily's wrist until it blanched white. The girl gasped silently, mouth open but voiceless. Jack lifted his arm, wedging his elbow between. "Let go of her." The words were calm but heavy, like a wedge driven into wood. Carla faltered half a beat, then jerked. Jack held firm, shifting his body to shield Emily from sliding farther down the steps. The bread lay soaked, wax paper darkened in the rain. "Step aside," Carla snapped. "This is my house. She's my child." She jerked her chin toward the dark doorway as if it were proof of ownership, her eyes never leaving his, her voice dropped sharp as a blade. "In this town, everyone knows whose business is whose. Stay away from her." Thunder rolled long, tiles shuddering overhead. Jack glanced at Emily, her lips bluish, shoulders trembling. He pressed a breath steady. "I'm not entering your house. I just won't stand by and watch violence in front of me." He didn't raise his voice. Each word came measured, like turning a screw with care. Carla spread her hand, laughed dry. "Violence?" She bent close to Emily's face, voice thick. "Hear that? He says I'm violent." Then she straightened, eyes flaring mockery. "Who do you think you are? A priest? A superhero?" Rain thickened, pounding the boards, splashing Emily's small hands. Jack stood tall, leaning to shield her, his body a makeshift roof. He didn't answer right away. In his mind flashed the table back home, 3 small bowls likely gone cold. Sarah maybe wrapping Lucy in a scarf, Ben peering out for his father's step. He shifted one step, balanced neither retreat nor advance close enough to keep Carla from yanking the child, distant enough to deny her a pretext for a fight. Carla drew in breath, then spat the words, "You want to teach me how to raise her?" The smile vanished. Her face was nothing but weariness and spite. Nobody wants her. Keeping her is already a blessing. Her grip still clamped, but slackened for the briefest instant. That instant was enough for Jack to set his hand between, prying Emily's wrist free. "Don't hurt her," Jack said. The silence after Carla's challenge lasted no longer than a clap of thunder. Rain poured heavy, slanting across the porch in a silver sheet. Emily stood wedged between them, clutching a small thing to her chest. Her father's metal ID tag, its corner bent, the etched numbers fading, strung on frayed twine. She always kept it hidden in her pocket, like a charm. Carla's eyes caught the glint. They narrowed. "What's that?" She reached. Emily stepped back, holding fast. "Give it here." "That belonged to my dad," Emily said softly, her voice trembling but clear. The words struck like a spark. Carla bit her lip and yanked hard. The string snapped with a sharp pop. The metal tag scraped across the back of Emily's hand, leaving a thin cut. The girl jerked, breath-breaking. Jack quickly pressed his handkerchief over it, wrapping the small, trembling hand. "That's enough," he said, low but firm. Carla raised the tag high, laughing harshly. "Trash. A cursed thing." She swung her arm, ready to fling it into the gutter. Emily lunged by instinct. Jack moved just as fast, blocking, his broad hand catching Carla's wrist before the tag could fly. Across the street, windows lit up, curtains stirred, eyes were watching. The tendons in Carla's neck bulged. She hissed through her teeth. "Putting on a pity show?" Her free hand clamped down on Emily's shoulder and shoved. The girl slipped, knee scraping the boards, the sound dry and sharp. Jack stepped between them, body turned slightly to shield her. "Stop this," he said, eyes locked on Carla. "She's hurt. Let her be, she deserves it." Carla snapped, though her glance flicked toward the gate where shapes had gathered into a few heads. Frustration mixed with the fear of being seen, sharpening her tone. "Why are you standing there? Get off my porch, both of you." Jack didn't move. He adjusted the handkerchief, tightened the knot, checked if the wound was deep. Emily bit her lip, silent. Suddenly, Carla lunged toward the doorway, snatching Emily's ragged cloth bag from a wooden peg. She shook it out, worn clothes tumbled down. She grabbed the whole bag and hurled it to the steps. "There's your stuff." Her other hand yanked off a loose sandal and tossed it after. "Since you like outsiders, so much go. Out of my sight." The words hit sharp as stones. No longer a threat, but a decision the only way she knew to silence those watching eyes in the rain. Jack lifted his gaze. He held Carla's eyes a long moment, not challenging, not pleading, then gave a short nod, as if to acknowledge what had just been done. He placed the tag into Emily's hand, closing her fingers around it. "Keep it." Carla gave a thin smile. "Good. Take the burden with you." She stepped back into the doorway, ready to throw another barb, but someone at the gate called softly, "That's enough, Carla." The words cut her short. Her face sagged, then hardened again. "Don't come here tomorrow making trouble," she spat. "I said I threw her out." Jack shrugged off his coat and draped it over Emily's shoulders. He bent, scooped up the bag, stuffed the fallen clothes inside, pulled the string tight. "Let's go," he told her quietly, as if it were nothing more than the ordinary order to step out of the rain. Emily clutched the tag, her other hand gripping the coat hem, and followed. Each step left a wet mark, but her stride steadied against the downpour. They descended the porch. Jack didn't look back. Behind them, Carla slammed the door, bolt clattering. A few neighbors' doors shut in haste. The smell of wet earth mixed with the faint iron of blood, fading into the warmth of his coat. At the end of the lane, Jack paused half a beat, looked at the girl. "Does it hurt?" Emily shook her head, though her eyes were blurred with rain. "Can you carry this?" He held out the bag. She hugged it close. The bandaged hand grew warm under the cloth. "Let's go home," Jack said. The word home wasn't loud, but enough to make Emily lift her eyes. A small light flickered there, then held steady. They turned past the birch trees, their figures fading into the thin rain. Behind them, the old porch was left with rice grains stuck to the boards, a shard of glass, and the sound of a lock twisting one more turn, the sound that once shrank a child's chest, now abandoned. At Jack's house, the door opened bright, warmth and the smell of dry wood spilling onto the porch. Jack bent to untie his shoes, motioned for Emily to do the same. She clutched the tag in her bandaged hand, shyly set her wet sandals on the mat. In the kitchen, Sarah lifted her head from her schoolbooks. Ben peered out from under the table with a half-built wooden box. Lucy clutched her teddy bear. All three froze a moment, wide-eyed as if caught in a flashlight beam. Jack said briefly, "A friend of mine. Her name's Emily." Ben stood, slipping a screw into his pocket. "She's staying tonight?" he asked quietly, unsure. "Yes," Jack answered, hanging up Emily's coat. "It's raining, and it's late." Lucy toddled over, eyes on the bandage around Emily's hand. "Does it hurt?" She held out her teddy bear. "You can borrow him." Emily hesitated, glanced at Jack. He nodded. She accepted, hugging it lightly. The old cotton smell was oddly soft. Sarah pulled out a chair, making space at the table. "Sit here." She looked at the bandage, then turned to Ben. "Get the first aid kit." Ben darted off, rummaged through a cupboard, and brought back a dented tin box. Jack washed his hands, set water to boil. He spoke as much to reassure Emily as to remind his children. "Here, anyone coming in from the rain gets hot tea." Steam fogged the kitchen glass. Sarah opened the tin, pulled out cotton and bandages. "Let's soak your hand a bit, it'll sting less," she said, asking nothing more. Emily nodded, lowered her hand into the warm water. The pain eased, her breath steadied. Ben hovered, curious at the glint of the metal tag in her other hand. "What's that?" Emily closed her fingers, whispering, "My dad's." Ben went quiet, stepped back, as if someone had warned him where not to tread. Jack set a bowl of reheated vegetable soup before Emily. "Eat a few spoonfuls to warm up." She looked around Sarah waiting beside her with the spoon. Ben turned aside so she wouldn't feel watched. Lucy propped her chin on her hands as if witnessing a ceremony. Emily sipped a small spoonful. Warmth spread down her throat into her chest, her heart slowing. She whispered, "Thank you." Sarah wrapped the cut neat and firm. "There. Tomorrow, if it hurts, tell me." Emily nodded, eyes lowered, though a faint glow lingered. "Tonight you'll take the couch," Jack said, pulling a thick blanket from the cupboard. "We'll sort a better place tomorrow." Sarah spread fresh sheets, squared the corners. Ben brought a clean pillow, tucked in its case. Lucy set the teddy at the edge, solemn as a guard. The room slowly quieted. The wall clock ticked past 10. Ben sat beside his wooden box, whispering to Emily without looking straight at her. "Tomorrow I'll finish the secret compartment in the box. If you want, I'll let you keep your tag in there." Emily clutched the blanket, startled by the plain offer. "Really? Really?" Ben scratched his neck, ears turning red. Sarah turned off most of the lights. "Here." She paused, searching for the exact words. "Nobody gets scolded for eating slow." The sentence dropped like a small stone blocking a rushing stream. Emily hugged the blanket tighter. From beneath the edge of the cloth, her hand slipped out, closed hard around the tag, and at last tucked it into the small pocket beside her pillow, safe for now. Lucy climbed onto the chair and whispered into Emily's ear, "If the thunder's loud, you can hold my hand." Emily smiled faintly. "Okay." The first nod she'd given another child in this new house. Jack stood at the doorway, taking in the whole picture. 3 children shifting because of one new presence, each in their own way curious, clumsy, and then finding the right thing to do. He said quietly, "Time for bed. Tomorrow will be a full day." The lights went out, leaving only a thin glow from the hall. In the dark, the rain on the roof steadied. Emily pulled the blanket up to her chin, warmth seeping into the coldest places inside her. In the corner, Ben closed his box. Sarah folded the towels. Lucy hugged her pillow back to her own bed. Jack locked the door, walked slowly through the kitchen, set the kettle back on the small stove. Before heading upstairs, he stopped by the couch. "All right?" he asked softly. Emily nodded in the dark. "Yes." The stairs creaked once, then stilled. Emily listened to the house. Human breathing, wood expanding with heat, the rain moving farther off. For the first time, she closed her eyes without waiting for the sound of a lock turning. On her blanket, Lucy's teddy lay guard at the pillow's edge, a child's promise, but binding. By morning, Maple Creek would buzz with whispers. But tonight, in the wooden house, one bowl had been washed, one wound bandaged, and one bed was warm enough for a child to breathe evenly. And as expected, the next morning Maple Creek was like a small yard of noise. The rumor that Jack had taken in the girl her mother abandoned spread faster than the wind down the slope to the post office. At the grocery beside the payphone, housewives waited for their sugar to be weighed, tongues moving faster than their hands. One tugged down her mask and spoke loud enough for 2 counters over to hear. "That girl took 100 lashes and still didn't learn. She's pure bad luck." Paper rubbed and squeaked. The shopkeeper slid a box of tea across the counter, added her piece. "I heard her mother left. Her father fell off the scaffolding. Black as pitch." Another woman shrugged. "Jack's kind-hearted, sure, but how's he going to raise her?" The word raise fell to the floor like a pebble rolling out the door. Emily stood by the flower shelf, clutching her cloth bag tight. She had come to buy a packet of salt as she'd been asked, but her feet stuck as if glued. Every phrase flung from the counter stabbed the back of her neck, colder than the draft through the doorway. She dropped her head, dodging the curious glances reflected in the glass candy case. Her hand curled, nails pressing white marks into her palm. Shame had no shape, but it struck heavy, like a basin of water dumped straight over her, clinging, freezing, impossible to wipe dry. The shop doorbell jingled. Pastor John stepped in, coat still wet with mist. He caught sight of Emily clutching her salt, head bowed. At the counter nearby, the words, "Bad luck, 100 lashes," still fell like a steady rain. Pastor John walked up, laid a bottle of milk and a small loaf of bread on the glass. He turned to Emily. "Would you help me carry these to Jack's house?" His voice was calm, steady enough for everyone to hear, but never sharp. The shopkeeper faltered. Curious stares lost some of their sting. Pastor John paid, covering Emily's salt as well. He smiled at the shopkeeper. "Put it on the church account for the children." Then he bent low, eye level with Emily. "People here talk plenty. You can't silence them all at once. But you can stand straight, and you won't be standing alone." He helped her adjust the strap of her bag, opened the door, and held the knob so she could step out first. At the threshold he paused, turned back, and spoke evenly. "If anyone has more to say, come by the church. I'll be glad to listen." The words settled like a small wedge among the crowd, enough to slow the whispering. Back at Jack's, the kitchen glowed warm with gentle yellow light. Sarah was washing dishes. Ben scraped leftover pancake batter from a plate. Lucy swung her legs from the high chair. The reheated vegetable soup simmered with quiet bubbles. Emily set the packet of salt on the table, then stepped back. At supper, Jack ladled her an extra half scoop, set it before her. Emily looked down, spoon stirring lightly in the bowl but not lifting. She didn't dare eat, afraid the sound of spoon on porcelain would summon the street's voices, afraid one bite would take food from Lucy, afraid swallowing would make her a burden again. Sarah noticed first. "Go ahead, eat," she said gently, like speaking to the wind. Ben dropped a piece of potato into her bowl, awkward but firm. Lucy whispered, "Eat," her words lisping, eyes wide. Emily pressed her lips, nudged the bowl away a little. I'm full," she said, her stomach tightening at the lie. The moment stretched across the table, no one able to mend it. Jack looked at his 3 children, then at Emily. He tapped his hand on the woodlight, but solid, enough to push back every whisper outside, every clink of spoon, every creak of chair. His words came clear, steady, not loud. "In this house, no one is a burden. We are a family. You don't have to be afraid of anything here." The 3 children stayed quiet, then seemed to exhale at the same time. Ben slid the bowl of potatoes a little closer to Emily again, not looking straight at her so she wouldn't feel uneasy. Sarah set a cup of warm water beside Emily's hand. Lucy gave a tiny smile, the kind only a child can make when she believes a promise is true the instant she hears it. Emily sat up straighter, picked up her spoon. She scooped a small bite, raised it slowly to her lips. Warmth spread into her tight chest. The first mouthful went down with effort, the second a little easier. She still didn't look at anyone, but her hand no longer trembled. Outside, a dog barked a short burst. By afternoon, the whispers on the street hadn't stopped. They simply changed alleys, changed mouths, added a few more details for spice. Jack likes meddling in other people's business. He just wants to play the hero. That girl's got something wrong with her. Maple Creek was small enough that everything ran into everything else. The bakery's glass door rattled each time it opened, nodding along with the women at the counter. On the road, the mailman fanned his letters hard to dry the sweat off, then snapped at a boy playing nearby. "Watch yourself bump into her and you'll catch her bad luck." Jack cleared the dishes, wiped the table, carried the trash to the lane. He didn't dodge anyone. He greeted as always, "Good afternoon," to the barber's wife. "The car running smooth yet?" to the mechanic. Some nodded faintly, some turned away. Jack knew those shifts of color. He'd lived here long enough to understand the town needed a story before supper. He gathered it quietly, like sweeping sawdust off the shop floor. You couldn't catch every speck, but you could keep it from flying into the children's eyes. Evening sank low. Emily sat on the back step, hugging her knees, listening to Sarah and Ben bicker over homework. Lucy dragged her teddy bear around in circles, now and then stopping to push a broken cookie into Emily's hand. The girl didn't dare eat it. She'd already had lunch, but she didn't dare refuse either, afraid to hurt the younger child's feelings. She held it until the cookie softened in her palm. Then came 2 knocks at the door. Pastor John stood on the porch, arms full of firewood wrapped in a small sack. Chimney smoke looked thin. He smiled. "I brought a little extra wood." Jack took the bundle, invited him in. Emily stood quickly by reflex, then sat back down when Pastor John waved her off. "Go on eating, child." He didn't ask many questions. He just sat at the edge of a chair, watching the children slide warm cups toward Emily. "The hardest thing," he said, almost as though reminding himself, "is to keep the rhythm of normal life while people stare. Keep making supper, fix the squeaky hinge, walk the kids to school. Small things done steady will quiet the noise outside." Jack nodded, his shoulders easing a little. Emily cradled her cup in both hands. Pastor John tilted his head. "You're doing well. Tomorrow, I'll leave an old comic book on the church bench. If you want it, come by and take it." He stood, adding a promise as much as advice. "If anyone speaks harshly, tell them to see me." Then he stepped out, shutting the door gently. His shoes blended into the wind through the birches. A few minutes later, a broad shadow filled the doorway, Wade blocking it, the smell of smoke and beer rushing into the kitchen. Breathing slowed in the house. His words fell heavy as stones. "Think you're a hero? Try raising her. You'll regret it." Across the road, under the trees, Pastor John had just reached the lane's end. Hearing Wade's voice, he paused. He didn't step back, and this was Jack's house to stand for, but his gaze held steady, calm as a milepost in the wind. saying without words, "Someone's beside you, even if he doesn't speak." The roadside tavern was dark as a cave, curtains thick with smoke. Pool balls clattered. An old song groaned from the jukebox. Carla walked in, hair in a tight bun, heels clacking on the wood floor. Wade Harper was already sunk into a corner, coat askew, glass of beer still full. He looked up, lip curling when Carla pulled a chair. "He really took her in," Carla said low, eyes flashing bitter. "Idiot man with nothing better to do." Wade grunted. "Jack thinks he's some kind of saint." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "If you want my help, just say it plain." Their heads bent together. The clink of spoon on glass covered part of it, but scraps still slipped through. "Drag her back. Teach her a lesson. Make sure she never dares again." Carla nodded, tapping her finger on the table in rhythm. "Tomorrow," she said, voice thin but sharp. "I'll go. You stay outside. If Jack interferes, you speak up." Wade chuckled, broad hand thumping the table to seal the promise. "Fine. Maple Creek needs order." At the counter, Amelia Wade's wife stood waiting for her paper sack to be packed. She had come looking for her husband, who'd said he'd just stop in 10 minutes. Not wanting a scene in public, she slipped into the back, asked the waitress to wrap some bread. The narrow hallway passed a thin wall behind the storage room. Right then, Carla's and Wade's voices slid through the crack. Amelia froze. Words like "teach her," "drag her back," struck her spine like stones. She clutched the sack tight, her heart beating in her ears. She didn't care much for Jack, nor was she close to Carla. But the thought of a child being hauled off in the night dried her throat. She backed away, slipped out the side door, peered once through the frosted glass. Wade and Carla still hunched, smirking. She decided not to wait for her husband. Outside, drizzle tapped the porch roof. Amelia pulled her coat close and walked quickly toward the church. The bell was silent, the yard empty. She knocked on the small office door behind the hall. Pastor John, a gray-haired man with kind, deep eyes opened, the smell of old paper and candle wax drifting out. "Father," Amelia said, her voice low, "I overheard. They plan to go to Jack's house. They said they'll take the girl back." It didn't sound right at all. Pastor John didn't press her. He only nodded, invited Amelia in, and listened until she'd said all she had. When she left, he stood a while under the yellow lamp, hand resting on the back of a wooden chair as if weighing its strength. Then he put on his coat and took his umbrella. That afternoon, Maple Creek sank into pale gray. Jack's kitchen glowed. Sarah was tying Lucy's hair. Ben spread his homework across the table. Emily sat at the edge of her chair, back straight, hands on her knees as if always ready to stand. When the knock came, she flinched. Jack opened the door. Pastor John stepped in, shaking the rain from his umbrella. "Hello, Jack," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I came by to see how the children are." Jack stepped aside. "Please, Father." Emily rose automatically, fumbling to set down the cup in her hand. Pastor John looked at her, then sat opposite, unhurried, as if he'd come only to wait for the right breath. He smiled, small enough not to make her retreat. "Hello, child." Emily nodded faintly. Her eyes opened just a crack, like a narrow door. Pastor John folded his hands on his knee, leaned just enough forward. "Do you know how brave you are? Not everyone could endure, and still stand straight the way you do." The words fell into the warm kitchen like a dry cloth laid across a fevered brow. Emily didn't answer right away. She looked at Jack, then at the wooden spoon on the shelf, as if to check whether what she'd heard could be true. A moment later, she nodded, very slightly. The first nod not to ask permission, not to admit guilt, but to accept recognition. Ben tilted his shoulder, grinning a little. Sarah exhaled as if she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Jack leaned against the counter, his eyes softening. Pastor John said no grander words. He asked Emily if she liked to draw, mentioned the church had some old crayons if she wanted them, and wondered if she'd help tend the flower beds out front on weekends. Each sentence was short, plain, set like nails in the right place. I can," Emily whispered, her voice sounding as though she'd found it at the back of a cluttered drawer. Lucy leaned over, pressed a gummy bear into her sister's hand. "For you." Emily smiled her first that day. Pastor John turned to Jack, lowered his voice. "I also came to say some are worried it'll get noisy. But don't worry. If they come, I'll be here beside you." Jack nodded, a wordless thank you. By full dark, Pastor John headed back to the church, his umbrella slanting across the wet road. The kitchen air held the scent of tea and quiet relief. Emily washed her cup, movement slow but sure, as if practicing a new skill. Calmness. Night fell, wind moving through the birches. A few neighbors' windows darkened. Sarah tucked Lucy in. Ben stacked his books. Jack locked the back gate. The fire snapped, kindling, bursting like punctuation marks. Emily spread a thin blanket on the couch, smoothing the wrinkles flat. Then came heavy footsteps in the lane, metal clanging at the gate. A woman's voice, hoarse and sharp, cut through the wind. The gate rattled hard against its post. Carla stood before the house. Her shadow stretched long on the wet ground, eyes glinting under the street lamp. Her hand clutched the bars, her shoulders shook with breath and leftover drink. She threw her head back, shouting for all of Maple Creek to hear, "Tomorrow I'll take her back, whether you want it or not." The next day, the church bell rang 3 short times. Pastor John pinned a notice to the wooden door. Community meeting regarding Emily. By the hour, the pews were full. The air was heavy as the sky before a storm. Damp coats, old wood, muffled coughs. People spoke low, but their eyes all fixed forward. Jack sat beside Emily. She hunched small, hands woven together, eyes following a hairline crack in the floorboards. Sarah, Ben, and Lucy sat behind, silent. Pastor John stepped to the pulpit, laid his hand on the wood edge, and said, "We are here to hear the truth, not to feed curiosity." He invited Jack to speak. Jack drew in a breath, looked across the room, then glanced at Emily. "That night," he said, his voice steady and deep, "I was walking past the lane when I heard a door slam. The child sat outside, stomach growling so loud it echoed. It was cold. The door was locked. I saw. A bowl of rice spilled across the porch boards. I heard words hurled from inside. Useless, leftover, burden. I don't tell this to accuse anyone. I tell it because I saw it, and I could not pretend I didn't." Several necks stiffened. Someone clicked their tongue softly. Jack paused, his hand gripping the pulpit edge to steady himself. "I offered her bread. I stepped in when her wrist was grabbed. I wasn't a hero. I just thought, right in front of my eyes, I couldn't let a child be treated that way." Pastor John nodded, taking the words. He looked around, pausing on faces known for street talk. "And not only that night," he said. "Many here have heard the story of 100 lashes. Some say it was only a threat. I remind you, it was real. I saw the old welts on her back when she came to the church last winter to borrow a coat. 100 strikes. No one should call that discipline." The sound in the church dropped, as though drained away. The grocer's wife bent her head, twisted her ring. A mechanic swallowed hard. At the back pew, 2 teenage girls stopped whispering. Suddenly, Amelia stood. Her eyes were bruised from sleepless nights, her hands clutching her purse tight to her chest like an anchor for calm. "I have something to say." She looked straight at the front row, where a few people had leaned forward to catch every word. "Last night at the tavern, I heard my husband Wade Harper speaking with Mrs. Carla. They said, 'Take the girl back. Punish her so she won't dare resist.' They set it for tomorrow. If the 2 of them were here, I'd say the same. I don't want to meddle in anyone's affairs, but I cannot stand by while a child is dragged off to be beaten again." A ripple of whispers ran the pews, then stilled. Wade was absent. Carla sat a row across, lips pressed, eyes cold. Amelia drew a deep breath, her voice steady now. "I went straight to Pastor John in the night." Pastor John thanked her, then stepped down from the pulpit and walked to the front pew. He sat level with Emily. "Would you like to say anything?" "No pressure," he said softly, but the gentleness carried through the room. Emily looked at Jack. He gave the slightest nod. She rose. Her knees trembled once, but she walked the aisle, stopping a few steps from the pulpit. Her voice was thin, but clear. I just want to live. To eat dinner with everyone. To sleep in a house where no one yells in my face." She swallowed, her eyes not seeking shelter anywhere but in her own words. "I'll wash dishes, sweep, do my schoolwork. I won't make noise. I don't know what misfortune I bring, but I don't want anyone to suffer because of me. I just want to be where I'm not afraid." Breaths pressed together. The baker's wife lowered her head, quietly dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. The mail carrier glanced down at his shoes. A man known for loud talk at the cafe pulled at his collar and shrank into his seat. Sarah laced her fingers, biting her lip. Ben gave a secret nod, as if scoring her bravery. Lucy curled her little finger in a silent, Good job. Not daring to make a sound. The silence stretched long enough to hear the fire crackle. Pastor John laid a hand on the pew rail. Thank you, child. He turned back to the room. We're not gathered to pass judgment, but to decide what kind of town we are. Do we protect those weaker than ourselves, or stand by and watch? Chairs scraped. An elderly man stood. I once thought she brought bad luck. I'm sorry. A schoolteacher nodded firmly. The church has a small room by the library, if shelter's needed. The grocer's wife stammered. I'll carry her tab on milk this week. The words tumbled over each other, clumsy but real. The floorboard suddenly groaned heavy. Carla shot to her feet, her chair clattering back. She strode into the aisle, chin thrust high, eyes flaring sharp. Her voice hissed through her teeth, then rose to the rafters. She's the devil. She's brought misfortune since her father died. Anyone who keeps her will be cursed. Before the echo faded, a figure stepped from the back row. Sheriff Briggs moved down the aisle, dark coat blotched with rain, his badge flashing under the overhead light. He raised his hand, his voice carrying steady under the vaulted ceiling. That's enough. We have ample witnesses here of neglect, insults, emotional abuse, and even beatings in the past. The church went still. Briggs glanced toward Jack, Pastor John, then settled briefly on Amelia. He gave the smallest nod, marking the words now spoken in public. Carla gripped her purse straps, eyes darting. Emily half hid behind Jack's shoulder, her heart pounding in her ears. Briggs took 2 more steps, his tone no louder but firm as iron. Carla, you're coming with me. He drew out the handcuffs. Metal clicked sharp. Carla recoiled, her chair screeching a long scar across the floor. You have no right, she screamed. She's the devil. Silence. Briggs didn't shout. His eyes cut the room. You've heard the testimony, and you yourself just confirmed your intent to take back the child by force. Carla broke from the row, lunging for the door. 2 townsmen, a mechanic and a lumber seller rose and blocked her path. Carla spun, hands flailing, her hair bun unraveling. Briggs closed in, turned her wrist, snapped the cuffs shut. Don't make this harder, he said, his breath even, his motion as practiced as a lifetime. The side door slammed open. Wade Harper stormed in, smoke and beer clinging to him. Get your hands off her, he bellowed, shoulders filling the aisle, his eyes cutting past Briggs to fix on Jack. You think you've won? No one answered. Wade barreled forward, trying to haul Carla up, but the pews rose like a tide. The mail carrier, the baker's wife, the knife grinder, even the boy who always kicked a ball on the lot, folks who once stepped off the sidewalk when Wade came by, now stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the aisle. Jack hadn't moved forward, but stood firm beside Emily, his body turned to shield her from Wade's swinging arm. Move, Wade roared. He shoved at a shoulder but was held. The mechanic's hand barred his chest, solid as oak. Wade stumbled half a step, stunned by the unyielding silence of the room. Sheriff Briggs didn't rush. He circled in, voice flat. Wade Harper, you're under restraint for threatening public disorder. Wade thrashed, but rough, steady hands pinned him. Briggs snapped the second cuff clack, a dry full stop. In the thin hush that followed, a cane tapped lightly on the floor. A silver-haired woman from the right pew leaned on her chair to rise. She looked around, her voice clear but not sharp. We've been silent too long. That child doesn't deserve this. No one clapped. People only nodded. One by one. The grocer's wife nodded, lips pressed tight. The mechanic nodded, eyes down on his oil-stained hands. The young teacher nodded, hand still resting on her lesson book. Pastor John bowed his head, fingers interlaced. Agreement spread like warmth, quiet, without slogans. Carla twisted in the cuffs, muttering curses under her breath. Wade ground his teeth, his face flushed red. Briggs kept his distance, steering them toward the door. Move, he said. Heavy footsteps fell, the cuffs clinking against each other in a rhythm. Emily pressed close to Jack. She watched Carla's hunched back, Wade's broad shoulders. The cold silver cuffs clamped around their wrists. What once lived only in threats had become something that made sound. The clang of metal, the scuff of shoes on wood, the breath of anger forced tight. Beside her, Jack's hand rested on her shoulder, not squeezing, just there. At the doorway, Briggs paused, glancing back a moment. His eyes swept the room once more, as if to confirm for everyone that what needed doing was done. Then he led them out. The church doors opened, a short draft of cold night rushing in, carrying the damp smell of darkness. Their shapes shrank down the steps, disappearing beyond the birch trees. Inside, whispers did not return right away. People exhaled as though laying down a debt. Sarah came around and clasped Emily's hand. Ben rose on his toes to peer out the side door, checking if the sheriff had gone. Lucy leaned close, whispering, "It's all right now, isn't it?" Emily didn't answer. She only stood, wide-eyed, staring at the door that had just closed, feeling her chest ease bit by bit. For the first time, those who had frightened her truly paid a price, not in promises, but in the cold shine of cuffs and the sound of footsteps leaving a crowded room. Jack tilted his head, murmuring, "You all right?" Emily nodded, very slowly. Outside, the church bell struck once, short and clean, like a latch closing on a scene that had just ended. Dawn broke over Maple Creek as if someone had tugged a sheer curtain of mist aside. The birch leaves still held drops of night. Sparrows chirped along the fence. In Jack's wooden house, children's laughter spilled in bursts, Lucy miscounting spoonfuls of sugar, Ben putting on a stern face to tease her, Sarah lowering the flame beneath the pot of porridge. Warmth and the scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen, drawing the family close. Emily sat at the table, her back straight but not stiff, eyes following the thin smoke rising from the bowl before her. Her spoon touched the porcelain with a soft clink. No shouted words cut into breakfast now. No hostile eyes watched from the head of the table. Sarah pushed her own bowl aside, laid a hand on Emily's shoulder, her voice firm and warm. "You're my sister. Don't be afraid anymore." Ben slid the bowl of blueberries her way. "This tastes better mixed in." Lucy, legs swinging above the floor, offered her plastic spoon. "Use this one, it's faster." Emily looked at each face, nodded slowly. She blew on the porridge, took a sip. Warmth slid down, opening her chest. Her eyelids eased, and her lips curved into a thin, pencil-lined smile, but a real one. Jack leaned against the kitchen doorway, towel still in hand. He looked at the scene before him and felt his shoulders lighter. Only a few days, yet the distance between a cold porch and this table seemed as long as a whole winter. From one moment of standing outside looking in, he had pulled Emily from the dark with small acts. A piece of bread offered, a word said in the right place, a time he stood between her and a pair of hands. He didn't think of himself as someone changing the world. He only knew that wood bent will straighten when warmed, a screw turned once more will hold, and a house grows larger by the space made for one more bowl. "Dad, can I set the bread out to dry?" Ben asked, tray already in hand. Jack nodded. Sarah passed Emily a clean cloth. "When you're done, you and I will make tea." Lucy bumped her head lightly against Emily's arm, then grinned, as if sealing the truth that this place was hers. 3 knocks at the door. Pastor John stood on the step, gray hair damp with dew. He came into the kitchen, set a small paper bag on the table. "Some old crayons as promised," he said, his eyes meeting Emily's for a beat. Then he turned to Jack, slipped off his coat, and spoke as though picking up a story left mid-sentence. "The town has learned something from this child, that sometimes truth is stronger than fear." Jack offered tea, but Pastor John only sipped warm water, standing as he watched the children divide the crayons. Emily picked up the brown one, tried tracing the outline of a window. Her hand shook at first, then steadied with each breath. Sarah tilted her head. "That's pretty." Ben leaned in, at a tree outside. Lucy propped her chin on her hands. "Draw the sun." Pastor John laid his hand on the chair back, smiled, gave a short farewell, and excused himself. He stepped into the yard, crossing a patch of sunlight stretching long, his coat brushing the dew-wet grass. The gate clicked shut, leaving behind a home filled with familiar quiet. When the meal was done, Emily carried the stack of bowls to the sink. Warm water ran over her hands. She didn't fear the clink of porcelain anymore. Sarah stood beside her, drying, stacking each dish neatly on the shelf. Ben pulled open the back door, sunlight spilling across the tiles like poured milk. "Come on out," he said with a wink. Lucy had already tied a scarf into a cape, running ahead. Emily hesitated half a step, then pushed the door open. Sunlight touched her face warm and clear. The yard smelled of freshly cut grass, the clothesline snapping in the breeze. She ran, feet splashing through the patches of light, hair flying loose. Laughter broke free, not strained, but round and true. Lucy chased her, calling, "Got you!" Ben stacked planks into a fort, making up nonsense about castles. Sarah stood on the porch, tying back a strand of hair, watching them all, her smile soft while her eyes glistened. Jack stood at the doorway, shading his eyes with his hand as he looked on. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly, as if speaking both to the day Emily first stepped into the house and to the weight that had just lifted off his own shoulders. A breeze drifted through the house, brushing the thin curtains. The old hinges creaked, yet the door swung wide and stayed open without a prop. The kitchen filled with light. On the table, Emily's bowl of porridge sat empty, her spoon resting still inside it, like a period closing out all the meals once haunted by threats. Outside, laughter carried across the yard. Emily tilted her face to the sun, squinting, arms spread as if to embrace the sky itself. She turned back, holding up her finished drawing. A wooden house, a birch tree, and a door flung wide open. Sarah clapped softly. Ben whistled. Lucy hopped on one foot. Jack took the paper, studied it closely, and nodded as if the proportions had come out just right. The door that had once slammed shut on Emily now opened, and this time, it opened onto an entirely new life. Spring came early to Maple Creek. On a Saturday morning, Jack's workshop stood ajar, the scent of fresh pine rising like warm breath. Emily stood by the planer's bench, both hands steadying a plank. Jack placed his hand on the tool, guiding her. "Don't press too hard. Just steady." The blade slid, curling shavings thin as cinnamon peel. Emily tried. The first pass snagged, clattering sharp. The second went smoother. The board's edge grew glossy, the roughness fading like old nights being smoothed away. Ben sat nearby with a small box, sketching on the lid. "Secret compartment here, for a nameplate." Emily laid her father's tag in her palm, turning it over as if asking its permission. "We'll keep it at home," she said. Ben nodded, carving careful lines with a craftsman's seriousness. Sarah brought ginger tea, setting it on the bench, reminding gently, "Your dad's worksite is an empty lot now, but we can bring flowers there." Lucy ran circles in the yard, hugging her teddy bear, sometimes shouting, "Doors open," as if it were a secret password. That evening, the church opened a small room off the hall, not for preaching, but simply to invite people to listen. Amelia stood by the table, stumbling through an apology to Jack and Emily. The storekeeper laid down a basket of fresh bread, her eyes ducking. Pastor John told a story about visiting a home with a baby who cried through the night. He never gave names, only asked, "If it were your child crying, what would you do?" Clumsy voices answered, "Hold them, bring water, sit with them." Simple replies found each other, brushing against places people had once passed by. At the end, he pinned a small paper on the bulletin board. "Listening group, Wednesdays. Anyone welcome." On Sunday, Jack's family walked to the empty lot where scaffolds once stood. Weeds spread over damp soil. Emily carried a bunch of wild daisies. She placed them by the fence, not praying aloud, only whispering, "I came." Beside her, Jack removed his hat and stood in silence. Ben stuffed his hands deep in his pockets, saying nothing about the secret box anymore. Sarah wrapped a scarf around Emily's shoulders against the wind. Lucy counted 1, 2, 3, then stopped, as if afraid reaching 100 might call back things best left quiet. Emily opened the new box, lined it with the tag, then closed it. She didn't leave it there, she carried it back. "It belongs in the house," she said, "so we can remember without being afraid." In the days after, Maple Creek slowly learned to speak more gently. Not everyone changed at once. At the cafe, there were still snorts of disapproval. But one morning, the mechanic who had blocked Wade at the church held open a shop door when he saw Emily carrying carrots. No applause followed, just a short nod, natural, as if it were simply the right thing to do. Jack repaired the front door at home. He and Emily removed the old hinges, worked in new oil. "Listen," Jack said. The door closed soft, no hiss of wind through cracks. Emily pressed her ear to the wood, smiling. Quiet as breathing, Lucy ran circles shouting, "Secret's a success." Sarah taped a note to the fridge. "Dinner rule, the slowest eater is still family." Ben scribbled beneath it, "Valuables go in the secret box, Emily keeps the key." Emily took Pastor John's pen and added in small letters, "No shouting in faces." One afternoon, Pastor John gathered the children to plant a young birch in front of the church. He dug the soil with a spade, asked Emily, "Want to give it a name?" Emily thought, then shook her head. "Let it just be a tree." Pastor John smiled. "Good. A tree doesn't need a name to grow." He had Lucy water it, Ben brace it, Sarah tie the twine. Jack stood farther back, hands in his pockets, watching. He didn't step in, only stayed there, like shade waiting for anyone who needed it. News of Carla and Wade faded like distant rain. Some said they had months of community service. Others spoke of a court date. Emily never asked. Once at the market, she saw a truck of workers parked at the town's edge. Neon vests bright orange. A woman bent to pick up litter, hair wound tight, shoulders hunched against the wind. Emily paused a step. Pastor John happened to pass, his hand resting on an old woman's wheelchair, looking the same direction. He didn't say, "Forgive." He didn't say, "Forget." He only asked, "You all right?" Emily nodded. She turned away, not from fear, but from choosing to look instead at what she wanted to grow. Pastor John kept the listening group open. This time, people came not only to speak of Emily, they talked about a boy who skipped school, about an old woman afraid to walk with weak knees, about a man who lost his dog. None of it changed the world, but it brought folks a little closer. When the meeting ended, Emily used her crayons to draw a small sign. Door open. Pastor John hung it in the hall, smiling. That's the spirit. By summer's end, Emily placed her father's tag in the secret compartment of the box. She didn't tie it shut with string, just pressed the lid, the magnets snapping together with a neat click. She set it on the shelf, at eye level. "Dad's here," she said, "in the house." Jack heard, stood silent for a long moment, then placed on the lid a small polished wooden peg, the kind he gave only when a piece was truly finished. One night, Emily pulled a sheet of paper from her notebook. The wooden house, the birch tree, the open door. She added one new detail, a figure standing in the doorway, hand outstretched. Below it, she wrote in tiny letters, "Opens from both sides." Then she smiled, folded the page, and placed it in the secret box beside the tag. The lid closed with a crisp click, tight as a promise. Outside on the porch, the first autumn wind passed through. The old door that had once slammed shut now held its peace, yet still spoke. In the way it opened steady, in the straight path from yard to kitchen, in the footsteps that no longer carried fear. And inside, there was a home that knew how to make room for one more bowl, wait for one more breath, and remember that truth once called by its name was stronger than all the fears that had once choked the town.